We are ready to get started with our first panel, which examines Iran's role in the Middle East. We are pleased to have Dr. Arman Mahmoudian moderate this panel. Dr. Mahmoudian is a research assistant at the Global and National Security Institute. Additionally, Dr. Mahmoudian serves as an adjunct faculty member at the USF Judy Genshaft Honors College, where he offers courses on Russia, the Middle East, and international security. Dr. Mahmoudian obtained his PhD in Politics and International Affairs from the University of South Florida, his master's in International Relations from Russia's People's Friendship University, and his bachelor's in law from the Islamic University of Tehran. Outside of academia, he frequently provides expert analysis in the media, having appeared on notable networks such as Al Jazeera and BBC Persia. I will now turn the discussion over to Dr. Mahmoudian, who will introduce the panelists, facilitate the discussion, and lead the question and answer session that follows.
Well, thank you, Dr. O'Kelly. Thank you for a very kind, informative introduction. Hello all, welcome back. It's good to see you all back. Before going forward, I would like to thank all previous speakers, General Mackenzie, Dr. Milani, and Dr. Valinas, for building up the foundation of this discussion for further panels. As you have seen in our agenda and been told by our moderator and Dr. O'Kelly, today we have planned 3 panels for you. But we have started to go with this one, the panel on Iran's regional policy. And there's a reason behind that. Actually, there's 2. The first reason is, as you all know, Iran's regional policy, in generally speaking, Iran's behavior in the Middle East, is the longest lasting source of conflict, or at least one of them, between Iran and the West. It began by Ayatollah Khomeini's calling of Iraqi people to overthrow Saddam's regime in 1980, and then continued by the deployment of Mohammad Rasulullah division of IRGC to Syria in 1982, which led to the foundation of Hezbollah. But the other reason, which might sound cliche or seemingly nothing new, it seems we are entering a new stage of heat with Iran in the Middle East. And the indicator of it is that the recent Israeli attack on Iran embassy. Many people are talking about the number of the killing and how it escalated the situation, but there is something else to it too. The number of high-rank officers who've been killed in Syria in the embassy, while the Syrian civil war as of 2018 and 19 relatively been secured in favor of Assad and Iran's interests, indicates that we are nowhere close to the ending of the Iran's regional policy or Iran's military presence in the Syria. As a matter of the fact, according to the Israeli officials, Iran has split about 5 divisions of its IRGC forces across the Syria within 12 to 13 military bases. Syrian observers and Syrian sources also been suggesting that as of 2021, Iran has launched a long-lasting endeavor to establish its brand new proxy in Syria, Al-Imam Hussein Division. But Syria is not the only case. A little bit to the south, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, the master product of Iran's regional policy, which once used to receive something at the neighborhood of $200 million annual budget from Iran, today is receiving something between $700 to $800 million, enabling the militia, which one might argue is the largest armed non-state actor on the earth, to possess an arsenal of between 130,000 rocket, missiles, and drones to 150,000. The recent exchange of fire between Israel and Hezbollah was a very, very, very small and minimal demonstration of that. A little bit to east, in Iraq, Iran's umbrella of Shia militias, which some sources suggest they possess something around 100,000 man force. Although their influence has been declining in Iraq since the killing of the General Soleimani, but they still are making a major influence on Iraq's decision-making. The attacks on U.S. bases in Jordan, the TAR-22 remote bases, which led to the killing of 3 American troops in January 2024, is an indicator of the Shia militias in Iraq, Iran-backed Shia militias, are still our primary actor. They still possess weaponry, and more importantly, they are quite reckless. But Iraq is not the only case. A little bit to south, in Yemen, the Iranian-backed Houthis, which once were an isolated tribal group, today, as Dr. Valinas stated, has turned and emerged as a global entity. Their attempts, successful or failed attacks to hijack shipments, indicates that Iran once again, after the Sassanid Empire, which declined 40 centuries ago, has successfully established a military influence in the Red Sea. All of these makes discussing the Iran's regional policy one more time important. However, as situation seems dire and quite unfortunate in the Middle East, you are quite fortunate people. The reason behind of that is we have a best assembly of experts and analysts to discuss Iran's regional policy for you. To my right, we have General Salene. General Salene is a major general of the U.S. Army. Major General Salene has begun its duty, active duty, in 1991. He graduated from the flight school in 1941. General Salene joined after that to the Marine Corps Air Station New River. He'd been deployed at the very beginning to Africa and Balkan. In 2008, General Salene was deployed to the Iraqi to contribute to Iraqi's Enduring Freedom operation. He led a cross-functional planning team for commanding general, but his journey in Middle East was not isolated or limited to the Iraq. Later, he continued his contribution to the U.S. Middle East policy in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, he was the lead architect for the regional combined team plan, a first long-range plan signed by the U.S., British, and Afghan civilian and military leadership. In 2020, General Salene was a military advisor to Mr. Khalilzad to facilitate the discussion between the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the Taliban. To right of the General Salene, we have another esteemed guest, Dr. Sanam Vakil. Dr. Sanam Vakil in 2023 was appointed as the director of the Middle East and North Africa program. Prior to that, she was the deputy director and the senior research fellow and led projects on Iran and Gulf Arab dynamics. Dr. Vakil researches focuses on regional security, Gulf politics, and future trends in Iran. To her right, we have Mr. Alex Vatanka. Mr. Alex Vatanka is the founding director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. He specializes in Middle East regional security with particular focus on Iran. He was formerly a senior analyst at the Janes Information Group in London. Mr. Vatanka is also a senior fellow in Middle East Studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations at Hubert Field. He had testified before the U.S. Congress and lectured widely for both governmental and non-governmental organizations. I do understand that you guys are not here to hear from me, so I'm going to start with our guests. But before going forward, let me give you a little bit in illustration of the structure of the panel. After my introductory remarks are ended, each panelist will share their insights with you for about 15 minutes. After that, they will go back to me. We have planned questions for our panelists. After that, the floor would be open to you. You have 30 minutes to ask the questions toward all of the panelists, and after that, we go back to our panelists to do their concluding remarks. I want to start with Mr. Vatanka at the end of the panel. Mr. Vatanka, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoudian, for that generous, kind introduction. Great to be with my fellow panelists and everyone here today. I look forward to it. If we could start with, I'm the only one, I think, with slides. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'll trust me, I won't spend too much time. But I was asked by Dr. Mahmoudian, and by the way, before I go on, Dr. Milani, thank you very much for having us here. General McKenzie, thank you so much to South Florida University, GNSI, pleasure to be here. I was asked to talk about the proxy model. So much has already been said. So I'm really kind of in not a good position. What can I say that you haven't already heard? But let me go back to an obvious question that I ask myself as someone who's working on a book project right now on what is Iran's Arab strategy? What does Iran want in the Arab world? As you heard, Iran is not a member of the Arab League. It's not an Arab country. It's always historically had all sorts of issues with the Arab world. Threats have come from the Arab world. So what is it Iran is so hell-bent on in terms of getting into Arab affairs for? So that's the key question I want to ask. And if I should go back to the next slide, to the agenda, sorry. Second one is, what's the basis of axis of resistance from what we can tell? And what are the strengths and weaknesses as you look at this model? It's been 22 years since the axis of resistance was born. It was born early on in 2002 in response to President George W. Bush coming up with the phrase axis of evil. And you've heard this already in remarks earlier today. So this definitely seems to be part of a reaction to American policies in the region. It wasn't something that came from nowhere. It was very much in reaction to what I think probably was an Iranian fear of what America intended to do with the Islamic Republic. So the question really is, 22 years later, is this cost-benefit analysis still working for the Islamic Republic? It might have worked really well, and it did post-2003 in Iraq. We all know the Iranians created a number of groups. They were doing the fighting for them. As Dr. Milani said, great, you want to kill yourself on my behalf, go for it, I love you for it. But is that going to be the way going forward? And that really raises a fundamental question that I think leadership in the Islamic Republic surely have in mind, which is, can I control the proxies that I've created over the last couple of decades? I think that's very much seems to be a question on in their minds. So if there is time, we have 15 minutes. If I could go to the next slide, please. I'll bring in the Houthis as a case study. But I really want to go back to this fundamental question. What does drive Iranian regional policy? Is it ideology, defense of the national interests, or something else? I'm not as sure as Dr. Milani that ideology is not really there in the driver's seat. I see it certainly in terms of where they stand in their regional agenda. That picture you see up there is from early 1979. That man is Yasser Arafat, the leader of PLO, going to visit the man who founded the Islamic Republic. Arafat had such high hopes for Khomeini and the Islamic Republic. With Iran on our side, which used to be a friend of Israel, we can turn the table around and get the Israelis to give what Arafat wanted. And this is where they fell out. Arafat went to Tehran and spoke to Khomeini and said, listen, I want you to help me create a state for the Palestinian people. Khomeini said, you're wrong. You're an Arab nationalist. You should think bigger. Think about Islam. And for Khomeini, the fight wasn't going to end with the creation of a Palestinian state. Arafat tried hard for the next year to try to get the Iranians to change their mind and start thinking in terms of the international rules that exist and how not to think open-ended ideological missions is the best way forward. He failed. And as we all know, famously, Arafat then ended up supporting Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Iran in September of 1980. That, to me, is the legacy of the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini. And if I read and listen to the man who followed him, 1989, Ayatollah Khamenei, and we all know these are two different men, the surnames are very similar, but Khomeini and Khamenei. Khamenei, 35 years in power, has pretty much in terms of the motto, the slogan, stuck to it. I totally agree with what we have heard so far this morning, that he's not suicidal. The regime isn't suicidal. If you're suicidal, you're not going to be around for half a century. So you do your cost-benefit analysis. But on the issue of Israel, he's very much left no space for negotiations. So if you're sitting in Jerusalem today, what is it the Islamic Republic wants from you? Right? So we're saying oftentimes this seems to be the most, to me, this is the fact that this is a question is kind of interesting. Iran's proxy model is oftentimes sold to us as defensive, that Iran is fearful that the Arabs are going to come again, right? Therefore, Iran takes the fight to them. That's what they call the forward defense. The forward defense idea is you're better off fighting them in Iraq, in Syria, so you don't have to fight them on your soil. But if you turn that around and said, let me talk to those people that I might be fighting in Syria and Iraq, say, what is it that you and I disagree with? And find a solution so you don't have to be in south of Lebanon. So you don't have to provide Hezbollah with 150,000 missiles. You could give them something else while you're protecting the Shia minority in Lebanon, which, by the way, even the Shah of Iran used to do. So there are different ways of looking at it instead of just looking at the proxy model is the only way that I can defend my national interest. That's my argument. And when I look at the literature that's out of Iran, I really don't see him think hard enough. Those people who are calling the shots, I get to that in a moment with another slide. So what you have right now with a quote like that, which is in Persian, that, it's a cancerous tumor. Actually, I have it in English too. Israel has to go. With a position like that, even if you don't mean it, it is shaping perceptions out there. It is certainly shaping the positions of members of the United States Congress, right, who cares so much about the well-being of Israel. So that, to me, is a recipe for every war. And when I look at in the region, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Moroccans, the Sudanese, They might have listened to these sort of very revolutionary, idealistic Iranian positions at some point in the past, the last 45 years, but that's not where we are today. So I think when we say Islamic Republic, as some analysts like to say, is misunderstood, everything they're doing in the region is actually out of fear. It's defensive. My argument is you can turn that around if you're Iran. You can have that conversation with the Americans. Now, again, I think Dr. Nas talked about Khamenei's worldview on the United States. Here's a man who, since he was president in the 80s, has always believed you can't trust the United States, right? That is his bottom line. That the Americans will sign agreements with you, but they'll walk away from it. That's just the way they are. And he will point to the Trump administration's maximum pressure and getting out of the JCPOA. That's his position. But again, I want to go back to another point. He is not suicidal either. He does cost-benefit analysis. So if you do, and I think General McKenzie was talking about, what kind of world could we live in where the United States can live with Iran being in the region and having some. That's the challenge then. Instead of talking about regime change, so they can be black and white about expressing their worldview. Sometimes the United States can be black and white. Some people in Washington, where I live, right now are saying the one thing that came out of the October 7th attack on Israel, the one thing that came out more loud and clear than anything else is that the mothership, meaning the Islamic Republic of Iran, has to go. Right? Well, will American politicians get around and come up with how you do that? That's a whole different story. But that doesn't go well with the idea that you want to coexist with Iran in the Middle East. So we need a shift in terms of our strategic thinking on this part as well. Look, I don't have time to get into some of the other issues, but I just want to say one other thing. And again, this was mentioned in the previous discussion between Vali and Mohsen. There is no domestic support in Iran, I estimate. This is not scientific. I haven't done my own surveys. There is no support in Iran that's significant for what the Iranian regime is doing in the region, including the fight against Israel, which vast majority of Iranians don't understand why we're fighting Israel. This is, at the very most, a fight between the Arabs and the Israelis. What's it to do with us, Iran, 600-700 kilometers away? And that's a very valid point. And again, if you can find a policy way to exploit that difference, let me give you one example. Iran intervened in Syria, 2013, began starting forces to Syria. Never has Iran, over the course of the last 10, 11, 12 years, sent conscript 18-year-old boys to Syria. They've always been volunteers from the Revolutionary Guards Corps, from the Quds Force. They created entities like the Fatimiyun from Afghan migrants, the Zainabiyun, the Pakistani Shias. They didn't have the courage, or they weren't reckless enough to take Iranian 18-year-old boys to go and fight and die for a guy called Bashar Assad in Syria. Why? For one simple reason. That's when you start getting the Iranian public opinion really irritated. This is not Saddam Hussein invading motherland Iran. This is a fight of our choice. We've decided to go out there and fight for Assad, who, by the way, we have ideologically nothing in common with. And from a sectarian point of view, we make stuff up. We say the Alawis are Shias, and so we can pretend that there is some basis for it. Essentially, it's a geopolitical contest or a choice, or a war of choice, the way I see it. And for that reason, and that was just one example. That strategic depth that you need for the country to go to war doesn't exist. And that surely must be on the mind of Khamenei. You heard all the things about why he's so keen on a smooth transition to the next supreme leader. Would you, if you were sitting there 84 years old, having been in power for 35 years, would you right now start something as reckless as a regional war, just as when you want to give on the torch, the baton to the guy who's going to come after you? I really think those are serious limitations also posed on Khamenei. Next slide, please, Glenn. I don't, again, want to talk too much about it. I said this thing with Israel began as a fight that was ideological in nature. When Khomeini turns around and says to the likes of Arafat, you don't know what you're talking about, then you know how hardline the Iranian position, at least to begin with, has been. And I don't think they've shifted that much away on Israel issue. Those people in the Iranian system that could have shifted it, they were in power most recently, 2013, 2021. You know the guy, Hassan Rouhani, President Rouhani, so-called moderate government. I think you also heard in the last panel, the Iranian system doesn't work that way. The president doesn't have power over what they're doing in the region, right? That sits with the gentleman in uniform next to them, the Revolutionary Guards. Now, I spend, as an Iran watcher, a lot of time looking at the individual biographies of people who end up in these different camps, and they are different worlds where they come from, right? Those people believing in moderation, maybe even having a position of compromising on issues like Israel and the United States, they tend to come from middle classes that is shrinking. They tend to come from families that had somebody overseas in the United States, Europe. They have learned languages, they have traveled. They are much more aware of the international system and what it would take for Iran to succeed. The folks in uniform, the Revolutionary Guards, people that joined the force at the same time as Qasem Soleimani, very much had the same kind of background. Central part of Iran, the rural parts, the central part of Iran, provinces like Isfahan, Kerman, Yazd, disproportionate number of poor young men in their late teens, early 20s, in 78, 79, put on the uniform. Most of them leftists to begin with. They already heard the Soviet-inspired anti-American, anti-imperialist talk growing up. And then at some point, they just make a turn and become Islamists, many of them, right? They just go from that pro-Soviet narrative to the Islamist narrative, which the Islamists adopted so well after 79, people like Khomeini. So these guys in the middle, the Revolutionary Guards, are the ones who are calling the shots when it comes to Iran's regional policy. And here's the most selfish part about these people. Those folks that were moderates, even if they could have pulled it off in terms of their policies, they always had the option of getting up and leaving if it didn't work out, right? They can, many of them, I mean, even someone like former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, technically, I'm sure, could get out of Iran and seek asylum somewhere else. These folks who are calling the shots when it comes to Iran's regional agenda, the Revolutionary Guards, the mothership, the ones who run around and arrange for what Quds Force does, they have nowhere to go. For them, this is it. This fight with the Americans is about their existence, not just as political actors, but maybe basically physically they might see themselves as America's next targets, right? So you see a big schism inside this Iranian regime between those who argue for diplomacy and those who believe diplomacy is a waste of your time. The only way forward is to carry on and fight on. And in the meantime, United States actions has created a whole new phenomena, because you could say, well, this thing wasn't really that deep, this enmity, and you could have made it turn away and maybe look for a way to compromise. Killing of some of their comrades, good or bad, I'm not going to get into that, including Qasem Soleimani, what the Israelis just did in Damascus. What has happened is what in Persian they call namus, honor. So for a lot of these people in the Revolutionary Guards, the fight with America now is about their honor, that they killed our brothers and our comrades. So, and that word was actually one that came to mind by this cleric here from Mashhad, the city where the supreme leader comes from, Ayatollah al-Mahouda, who said, the fight against Israel is about our honor. You know, some people measure the national interest in terms of how much GDP growth comes out of if you change your foreign policy. None of that matters to us. It's about honor. They've been killing our comrades, and we're going to get to them. But he also says in the same speech, time is of essence. Don't rush into it. Again, to a point we've heard repeatedly today, they do cost-benefit analysis. So the Iranian regime, the last, 10 days, 1st of April, the struck happened in Damascus. What have they done more than anything else? Managing that messaging. Oh, we're going to strike back, but we're going to take our time. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I think I'm coming to, I got maybe 5 minutes. Is that right? About 5 minutes? I'll wrap up soon. Look, everyone in this room knows about the proxy model, all the groups that exist. I just put some flags here for some entertainment. You all know the flags too. It's always been a mix of ideology and pragmatic needs in the way they were created. The first major Iranian proxy, since we're talking so much today about Gaza, wasn't actually Hezbollah in 82, it was 81. It was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The only reason the Iranians created Palestinian Islamic Jihad was because Yasser Arafat didn't want to listen to Khomeini. I don't believe in your open-ended Islamic revolution. I want a Palestinian state. So what did the Iranians do? They found a smaller group called the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. 45 years later, they got about 1,000, 2,000 fighters, right? And they subscribe in the same ideology as the Islamic Republic. But my point is, they are not the show in Palestine among the Palestinians. Iran couldn't dominate the Palestinian narrative. Arafat was still their leader. Hamas is not an Iranian proxy today. Anybody who says Hamas jumps when Iran says jump hasn't studied what Hamas and Iran did the last 10 years. So there's a major spectrum of proxies There are proxies that are basically guys in pickup trucks, Kalashnikovs that Iran controls because they own everything. And then you got the Houthis on the other end of the spectrum that has their own identity, that their own agenda, domestic Yemeni agenda, agenda in the Arab world. And by the way, since we talked about the Houthis, they don't have the Iranian supreme leader as their supreme leader. They have their own supreme leader. You never see Ali Khamenei's picture in parades in Sanaa when they're out. You might see Hassan Nasrallah, but never that Iranian Persian fellow by the name of Khamenei. So my point about the proxies is the spectrum is pretty wide. You got to identify this idea that 15, 20 groups are all Iranian proxies. They all have the same relationship with Iran. Just doesn't add up when we look at the evidence. Again, going back to something that we can link to US policy options, every single proxy in the region has come about as a result of a security vacuum somewhere in the region. Most famous one, Lebanese civil war, Hezbollah is born, right? You cannot point to a single place in the Middle East or anywhere else where the Iranian system could walk into that theater with its message, regardless of how much money and material goods they brought, and say, I'm going to turn your political system around and make it look like me. Never happened. In Shia majority countries like Azerbaijan, Bahrain, in places like Bosnia where Iran intervened, not a Shia country, but what are the Bosnians doing today? They're looking for European Union membership, not Iranian support. So my point is, if there is a security vacuum, that's how the Iranian system can come in and create proxies. You want to prevent Iranian proxies? Make sure there isn't a security vacuum. Or work with partners. We were talking about Iraq before, the main, maybe potentially biggest battle zone between US and Iran in years to come. Make sure the Iranians don't have a fight on their hands. Create Iraqi partners that will counter the Iranian message. One final thing I say about this slide is ask you two things. One is Israel is upending the proxy war model and the cost-benefit analysis. Israel has taken the fight to Iran to put, I think, to say to the Iranians, either pull away, because remember, the strike on Damascus happened a couple of days after Iran hosted the senior military leadership of all Palestinian factions. For the Israelis, Iran isn't, as I said the other day on TV, not an innocent bystander. Iran is very much a facilitator and involved. So if you think you can sit there 500 kilometers away and keep giving everybody missiles and come after me without paying the price, think again. I'm taking the fight to you. And that's what Israel has done for years, but increasingly so. And I fear this, that it might actually result in Israel starting to arm some groups inside of Iran. We've seen some real serious tension in the southeast of the country on the border with Pakistan in the Baluch region. I don't think these are just local actors. There's a foreign hand here. And again, how do you then talk about Iranian national security interest? Hey, I can help Hezbollah over there on the Mediterranean, but I can't protect my own region of Baluchistan where I have far more strategic interest. One thing I should say, and I think everyone in the room knows this, but when we're talking about proxies, Iran is not the only country in the region that engages in use of proxies. That's another thing we have to be honest. Everybody in the region uses proxies. The Turks do, the Gulf states do, and for the Iranians, the biggest proxy in the region is actually Israel, used by the United States. So they don't think they're doing something extremely different, elaborate, or new. They're just doing what others have been doing for some time. Next slide, then. I think I should stop. So I will not talk about the U.S. strategy. I will just say I don't think the U.S. has a strategy. It requires a lot of political capital. If you think Europe needed a Marshall Plan after 45 to turn Europe around and keep the Soviets out, you need something much bigger for the Middle East, just because the circumstances are so much more complicated. And I didn't even get to the Houthis, but hope maybe in the questions and in the discussion part we can get to that. But I'll just say this one thing, final thing, Arman, and then I'll stop. I promise. This proxy model, boy, if you believe in economic integration of the region, this business of guys with guns at a low cost going around and ruining things, blowing up pipelines, threatening ports, they're preventing the one thing that the United States should do a lot more on encouraging, which is economic development, economic integration. because that's how you get those boys and girls jobs, and that's how they stop looking and listening to those radicals of whatever color they are from. And right now, the proxies, as we've seen, are such a cheap way for a state actor to use to undermine the economic interest of another fellow member in the region state. So that's one way of also of looking at the negative aspects of the proxy model. Boy, I talked more than I should have. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Vatanka. Dr. Vakil.
It's a great pleasure to be here on this panel with my esteemed speakers, and a big thank you to GNSI, USF, Dr. Milani, and of course Heather Ward. I feel really lucky to follow Alex and Vali and Mohsen, so it sort of laid the groundwork for a further, more deep dive into other parts of the axis of resistance, which is my remit for this discussion today. I do want to build on what Alex said, and also Vali, to describe how we see the axis. We do a lot of work on this in Chatham House, excuse me, in London. And the axis of resistance is, in fact, the offensive defense, the forward defense of the Islamic Republic, providing Iran with deterrence forces. It's certainly been built over 2 decades, if not longer, as Alex described. And by no means is this network monolithic, homogeneous, or easily managed. And what I hope to do is give you a bit of a SWOT analysis of groups in the Levant, across Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, to better understand the axis, which is really effectively a network of proxies and partners that over time have grown in capacity, military capacity, financial independence, as well as political autonomy and authority within their own landscapes. And this is important to understand because more often than not, you oftentimes hear this analysis that if you cut off the head of the Hydra, the axis of resistance as I see it, and the Hydra perhaps the head, one of the heads, or the biggest head being that of Iran, the axis will disintegrate into the landscape of the Middle East. And that's not the case. Over multiple decades now, this axis has grown within the domestic context of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, inside Palestine, and in the Houthis, that I'm sure Alex will discuss in the Q&A, and have developed their own interests, local as well as regional. And today, particularly since October 7th, this is the first time we're seeing the transnational operational nature of the axis of resistance. So this is the first time we're seeing their strengths, their weaknesses, and they're certainly adaptive and adjusting to the landscape. The axis in general, at least from Iran's perspective, has been very helpful because it has built a strategically lonely and isolated country as Iran sees itself, helped Iran build influence and address its regional security dilemma, one that I think is of its own making. I'm someone that believes Iran has agency here. It's not just everybody else's fault. Iran also is a part of this story. And through this investment, Iran has sown disorder across the region, has destabilized weak states, particularly states that have had security vacuums, as Alex mentioned. What is unique to the way Iran has operated is that Iran builds these relationships gradually, builds these relationships consistently, opportunistically, reactively, and it fills vacuums. And so if we look at the landscape in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, there are certain commonalities to the way the axis of resistance has grown over a number of decades. Now, there wasn't a model that was built in 1981 in the box that they've successfully managed to roll out. Iran is a reactive player in the region, and it adjusts its tactics like most states do, like most institutions do, like most individuals do. So it's important that we adjust our understanding of the Iranian model and not continue to look at Iran as a static player, which is more often than not how I see Iran described. Particularly by a lot of the analytical community. In 2008, actually, an IRGC commander described Muslim nations are the strategic depth of the Islamic Republic. And in 2014, we had another sort of inflammatory statement from an Iranian political figure who said that Iran controls 4 Arab capitals. This is just to give you a bit of framing of the thinking of Tehran. This isn't really, let's say, a contemporary view of how the axis operates, but Iran saw the value of this axis to protect its interests and influence, to push its threats away from its borders, and to fill vacuums. And many of the vacuums that Iran has filled, and it doesn't fill it completely, there are many other players in all of these countries, and that's very important to understand, and those players are equally destructive in certain circumstances, but are equally important to invest in, perhaps to balance against Iran's influence over a longer period of time. To take things forward, I think it's a mistake to see the relationship solely as military. We must see the relationships beyond that. They have evolved into political relationships in all of these countries where the axis is now deeply embedded into the political landscape. They are political actors, political players. In some cases, they answer to constituencies. So they have different roles and responsibilities that are key there as well. The axis is also economic and particularly reactive to the growing impact of sanctions and the sanctions climate in the Middle East against Iran, but also across the axis of resistance. The axis of resistance has begun over many years now to work together in mafia-style economic activities. They are deeply embedded into the economies of all of these countries. So be it smuggling, be it even through legitimate business, the axis is embedded. And so just thinking about policy solutions to address the hydra requires a bit more of a holistic approach, but also a local approach. So I think that's important. And finally, I think it's important to understand the ideology of the axis. It's sometimes referred to and discussed as being religiously aligned, and we've got different views on those sort of alignments, and Dr. Milani talked about the pragmatism of Iran and the fluidity in Iran's ideology. The ideology is aligned together and bound together by resistance. And that's what's important to understand. And the nature of resistance, being it against the United States primarily, and of course its proxy in the Middle East, Israel, keeps this group alive and fed, and it's a diet of real motivation and mobilization across the region. At insecurity vacuums, particularly like one that we're seeing play out over a very protracted war, that diet of ideology and resistance can really be inflammatory and increase mobilization. And so I think we have to keep that in the back of our minds as well. So if we want to just deep dive quickly into Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon and try to pick up some patterns of how Iran operates and has supported groups across these different countries, one, I think, very clear, obvious theme is that Iran has intervened in all of these countries, and its interventions are linked to wars. Wars not of Iran's own making, but wars that Iran has, intervened into to protect its own interests. In the case of Iraq, obviously, in 2003, the presence of U.S. forces very close to Iran was a huge threat, and that's important to understand. Obviously, through the course of Iran's entry into protecting its interests, what Iran then does is to try to achieve military gains. And then the third phase is to then embed itself in the context, in the country, in order to advance its position. And here again, in Iraq, it's managed to achieve that, let's say, because, of course, it took a much more aggressive approach to American forces in Iraq. From 2005 to 2007, and in Iran and beyond, it then worked to push out the U.S. From Iraq in 2011. When ISIS reemerged, and that was a real existential threat for Iran, it extended its military force at the same time. And then once those gains were achieved, again, the Iranians have worked to build a political consensus inside the country to its favor, but also ultimately to weaken and push out the U.S. forces in the country. The PMFs, the Popular Mobilization Units, or the Hash-Shabi that are created, often described as Shia militia, but that's wrong because it's every group has a militia, and Iran supports every group regardless of religious orientation. Some are now in government, some are closely aligned to the Prime Minister's office, some are in opposition, but Iran has worked with the formal elected groups, but also the parochial groups that have their local interests in order to spread its network, to build its influence, to use the local economies also for smuggling, for sanctions busting, and the like. In Iraq in particular, of course, with the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, the axis of resistance took a big hit. Obviously, the axis was very much managed personally by a very key figure, Soleimani himself, but also by Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was also killed alongside Qasem Soleimani. That killing led to a shift in the way the axis operated, and there began to be more coordination among the different frontiers. And through this process, Hezbollah has become an even more important partner in the axis of resistance, managing the groups, playing a coordinated role, and allowing for Iran to shift the way it operates away from, let's say, a personal nature and relationships to much more institutional under the new leader, Ismail Ghani. I won't really go too much into the economics, but it's very important. Shift quickly to Lebanon and talk about how Hezbollah has grown from being a militia to now effectively a transnational expeditionary force that also has political power and economic independence from Iran. This, of course, was not the plan in the early 1980s, but again, through a myriad of twists and turns of history and maybe lack of sort of accountability or enforcement from regional states as well as Western states, the Taif Accord was signed in 1989. Hezbollah wasn't demilitarized. 2000, Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon. In 2005, Syria withdraws from Lebanon, and of course, the key force, emerging from this is Hezbollah, that sort of grows and reacts and is fortified with the help of Iran. The 2006 Hezbollah-Israel war, seen to be a military victory for Israel, was actually a symbolic and psychological victory for Hezbollah. And that, of course, advanced Hezbollah's status and confidence in the region, and Hezbollah from then became a much more important player in the axis of resistance. In 2011, it was key, coordinating with Iran in their intervention into Syria. And since then, clearly, Hezbollah and Iran have worked together, not just in the Lebanese conflict, but also in the Syrian conflict and in Yemen, and of course in fighting in Tikrit against ISIS. So it just shows the greater connectivity and the mobilization that has emerged over time. Hezbollah, of course, has grown in influence politically, gaining from the sort of chaotic nature of the Lebanese political system. It has developed cross-party alliances, has cabinet positions, and of course has become a big obstruction to effective governance in the country. And I think this is a very important point. It's important not to see this axis as like this very great success story. It, of course, has been relatively successful in providing a degree of deterrence for Iran. But there are challenges that come with the axis of resistance. And of course, here you see the axis as a real destabilizing influence across all of these countries. They're not investing in accountability and governance. And in fact, in all of these theaters, there have been popular protests against the role of the axis of resistance, against the forces of Hezbollah and Iran. in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, and of course in Iran itself. So playing this out over a longer period of time, this is not a group of players or individuals that is looking to build jobs and security for the future of the younger generation of the Middle East. This is a group that is looking very much to protect its own interests. Nevertheless, of course, a similar pattern of gradual gains can also be seen in the context of Syria with the intervention in 2012 to protect Bashar al-Assad. It's important to remember that the Syrian-Iranian relationship didn't just emerge from the ashes of the Arab Spring. It dates back decades to the 1970s, and particularly between the Assad and Islamic Republic's relationship during the Iran-Iraq War. Iran nurtures relationships, and I think that Iran has a sort of never forget kind of hostage taking sort of mantra on all of the groups and players that it influences in the region. It comes to your aid, but it never lets you forget that it helped you out in the long run. And it's done the same with other states in the region, for example, like Qatar, and we can keep playing out others that we can identify. By 2016, they had, with the Russians' help, taken over Aleppo, and by 2017, Iran and Hezbollah had expanded south and east in Syria. And you know, just last year, Bashar al-Assad was rehabilitated across the Middle East, invited back to the Arab League. This was not criticized in Tehran, but rather celebrated and seen to be an effective sign that the axis of resistance strategy has been successful. Iran very much welcomes all of these groups engaging more broadly beyond this scope and theater. It very much supports these groups developing relationships beyond Iran's. Iran doesn't want to have to own the relationships. Iran very much sees their integration into the domestic landscape of the countries where they are, but also with other states, is very important to the long-term success of the axis of resistance. So what does this all tell us? I mean, these groups are here to stay. And again, they have economic, political, military, and ideological connectivity. That is certainly growing and is certainly adapting to what we are seeing play out today from the war in Gaza. It tells us that mowing the lawn doesn't work. Israel has long taken an approach about mowing the lawn with Hamas in Gaza, and that on its own isn't a strategy to defeating Iran's role or Iran's support for the axis of resistance. Rather, what's ultimately needed, and this is what's a bit tricky, particularly when you try to get this in front of policymakers that are trying to provide quick approaches to addressing Iran's role in the region, you have to address the accountability, governance, and structural vacuums that exist across these landscapes. The policy solutions are much more structural rather than military. You can sanction all of these groups and individuals as much as you want. They will find other ways to survive. The Hydra will continue to grow new heads. There is deep embedded interest for these groups and individuals to survive. They're all getting these are jobs effectively. They're on payrolls, their salaries. So what you do need to do is close down the structural gaps. You have to address structural violence in these societies. And that, of course, is a longer, bigger ask. Quickly on the weaknesses and opportunities, of course, there are weaknesses to the axis of resistance, and we should not over-celebrate by any means the axis as being a network of strength. Oftentimes, the axis is uncontrollable, and they operate out of command and control. There is no command and control in many cases, and that, of course, is quite dangerous. The axis has domestic priorities, and it's important to understand those domestic priorities and try to use those priorities or leverage those priorities when possible. I've already mentioned that there are protests in each of these contexts and protests against the axis of resistance, and so that is certainly a weakness or an opportunity depending on how you want to look at it. There are financial constraints that the axis is experiencing. Of course, it finds workarounds, and it's involved in a lot of dodgy undercover financing that is really quite dangerous. And perhaps, we might say that In the context of the war, the Axis might be losing deterrence. We don't know. We're very much in the fog of war. But certainly the Axis of Resistance has adapted to Israel's octopus strategy over the past few years and is trying to employ a new model to operate and to make gains. Over the long run, though, without an effective strategy, and I think we're sort of echoing that a more strategic approach to the Axis is needed, the Axis is going to grow. The Axis is already identifying new opportunities. Dr. Milani mentioned the West Bank, and that's been there for quite a while. Whether it's trying to inflame popular views across the Middle East, inside protests, the Axis of Resistance certainly is going to capitalize on the chaos in Gaza and the vacuums there for its own purposes. I also see opportunities for the Axis to grow in the Caucasus, particularly in the context also of Central Asian tensions, of Azerbaijan and Armenia. Finally, the Horn of Africa is looking like really hot, and nobody's paying attention to what's going on there, and I find that really, really concerning. Above all, the Axis of Resistance is testing its transnational operations. They cut their teeth in Tikrit, in Aleppo, and Sana'a, and today we are seeing the Axis work together in an unprecedented way on TikTok, across the region, sharing intelligence, sharing defense strategies, sharing operations and capacity building. So in order to address this transnational approach, we have to have a transnational response. Hercules tackled the Hydra not on its own, but in cooperation with many actors. And that same sort of approach is also going to be needed. And beyond that, I think we have to think about the economic tentacles of the Axis of Resistance that sort of thrive on sanctions and find new ways to embed themselves in these economies and make the Axis harder to unravel as well. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Vakil.
Thank you very much. So one of the joys of being last on a panel is you can listen to the views of your distinguished partners. One of the risks about being last on a panel is, of course, many of the things you thought to say, your distinguished panelists have already said. So in an effort not to belabor some of the points, I will adjust slightly and then react to some of the things that will be said, and then open it up for a dialogue. But before I did so, I thought I'd express appreciation for the university and for you, sir, for having me here. I think it's important for us as a society to be presented with multiple views. So to have it from distinguished academics, we know we have private industry and society here, as well as military professionals, contribute to the overall dialogue on important strategic issues of the day. That is an important thing. And I also believe that there are some students here. If you are a student here at the University of Southern, could you raise your hand, please? Fantastic, fantastic. I'd like to extend an appreciation to you for taking time out of your studies, and I'm sure there are other things you could be doing on a fine spring day, but you're choosing to invest it here, to participate in a dialogue in a university in order to grow. You are our future. Our society will depend upon informed people who can make decisions on their own and exercise your skills of critical thinking, because one day you may be a policymaker or a diplomat or an informed citizen, which is required for our republic to continue. So thank you for the young people for being here and being part of this today. So to talk about Iran's strategy, I thought first to preface it by saying my views would be that of a serving U.S. military officer. I am not a policymaker. And ground our view of Iran's military strategy from how we see it from U.S. Central Command, which is a reminder to the audience, extends from Cairo to Kazakhstan. It's inclusive of Israel, about 560 million people. But it's embedded in the national defense strategy supporting to the national security strategy, which I will touch upon a little bit later. Iran's national strategy, military strategy. I thought it was very interesting when we talk about Iran to make sure that when we're speaking that we're talking about the regime, not all the people. I think that as well for our distinguished moderator here, that there are different views inside of Iran. So when I speak and I say the Iranian regime, the people, I'm talking about their policies and the things that they are doing, not all the human beings inside of it. As an illustration of this, I would encourage folks out there to look at some of the videos that came out after the hijab protests, right, the deaths, and you could see the Iranian people, many of the young people in these videos, wearing blue jeans, ball caps. It looked very similar to the young people that we have on our streets today. And I believe that the fireside chat that preceded this conversation also discussed perhaps some distance between the Iranian people, knowing that there are many different parts of that society, and the regime that lays over the top. So as I discuss Iran's military strategy, I mean in terms of the regime and the policies they are taking, recognizing there could be some distance in the people there, and that is probably worthy of a further discussion. For the military strategy, the way that we see it now playing out in the central region, that we now face the most volatile security situation in the past half century. As has been noted by the distinguished panelists here, Iran's regime has activated its network of proxies, not all of them being the same, in a way that we have not seen previously. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity from the Iranian regime perspective to reshape the Middle East to its advantage. And here's what we mean. I think this is an important juxtaposition. What are the regime's objectives? 1, to expel our presence. 2, to neutralize our influence. And why? To support the long-term strategic objectives to further the revolution. To further the revolution and to establish regional hegemony. Standing in that way is us and our approach. Meaning standing in the way of Iran's regional hegemony is should its neighbors, particularly the Arab neighbors, continue to expand their integration. They continue to expand their integration and deepen their relationship with the United States, as well as our like-minded allies. That is 2 different views. What is it that the United States seeks? I would encourage you to read our national strategic documents so you don't just take it from me. As you know from our national strategy, we seek a world in which is stable and secure. It's what we seek for the Middle East. That is the best way to create an environment that protects our national interests, protects those of our allies, and enables our partners to prosper. That's the vision. Juxtaposed against a vision of instability and violence that seeks to further a revolution. These are 2 different views. You bring it down a notch and you look inside what is it that the military elements of the strategy, recognizing, and I think that our panelists have described this well, that from a military point of view, we are necessary but not sufficient. Necessary but not sufficient to achieve our overall policy objectives. So if you look across at the Iranian regime, what are the key elements of its military strategy? First, to achieve a threshold nuclear weapons capability. This allows the Iranian regime to accrue some of the advantages without incurring risk. Second is to advance its standoff weapons capability and to proliferate them. Proliferate them, not only in the region, but beyond, which then talks to instability, which threatens NATO, our allies, and other places around the globe. And I agree with your point that we are not paying enough attention to the Horn of Africa. And third element, which has been covered in great detail here, is to leverage a vast network of proxies, not all of whom are the same, in order to create instability. And as has been said here, to take advantage of instability elsewhere, to increase that, to create a dense defense in depth. So these are 3 key military elements that we see from the Iranian regime. And I'll talk into a little bit more detail about each of those things, then perhaps go to the implications this has for us, and then a little bit about what we are doing in counter to it, because I know that you had stopped, Alex, before getting to that point. First, Iran continues its nuclear program. It gives it international leverage and the benefits from being a threshold state. I will point to February the 10th. For their International Atomic Energy Agency, if you recall the report, which had said that Iran had amassed 121.5 kilogram stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. That seems far beyond what is needed for commercial use. Second, should Iran decide it could enrich enough uranium for 3 nuclear devices within weeks. Give pause for a second to think of what that would mean. A nuclear-armed Iran would transform the region overnight and forever, likely igniting a regional race for nuclear weapons while creating an umbrella for its hegemonic ambitions. This current trajectory of developing highly enriched uranium, coupled with advances in its ballistic missile technology, will continue to challenge the United States and threaten not just us, but our partners and our allies and the rest of the world. Ought to lead with that. The second element, for its advanced conventional weapons, and for this we mean things like precision-guided ballistic missiles. I would note the first use of an anti-ship ballistic missile in anger we have seen over the last year. And I know you didn't get a chance to speak to the Houthi elements. But this proliferation of this technology to threaten the freedom of navigation enabled by Iran should give us all pause. The second is the growing capability for the uncrewed aerial systems. You are probably all familiar with the Shahed systems that are out there, where they're proliferating throughout the region and beyond, which we'll return to in a moment. These capabilities enable Iran to strike every country in the central region and to range key U.S. allies as far away as Europe. As we know, Iran distributes many of these capabilities to its network. This, as had been said here, should also cause us concern. The network isn't a perfect arrangement of command and control, has been said. And proxies often have a mind of their own and will react in accordance with their own domestic political considerations. What this means for a hegemon employing proxies, of course, is risk. As a military professional, of course, we know that war is not foreordained. We know that a contest between systems doesn't have a definitive outcome. We know that chance plays a role. And so as Iran proliferates its capabilities to its network and beyond, we should all be mindful of what risk does that pose, not just to our country, but to our allies and partners and stability across the world. You wanted more evidence of this instability. I would point to the funding and support that Iran provided to Hamas prior to the 7th of October. And I would encourage you not just to take my word for it, but to do your own research and see the statements that Hamas has made about the support. I would point to some of the effects that its proxies have had. You have mentioned Iraq and Syria. As you know today, we have many young women and men who are currently serving in harm's way in Iraq and Syria as part of the Operation Inherent Resolve. And as a note, and for the record, this includes our allies and our partners, some of whom are here today. When Iranian-aligned militia groups choose to strike at U.S. and coalition forces, it then causes those people to come off of their mission to defeat ISIS. I do not know if we have spoken about ISIS much in this forum. I would note that this activity that Iran sponsors effect is to pull back on the mission, thereby increasing the risk to the world of ISIS. It's not defeated in the physical sense, but the ideology is not. And there is every indication that ISIS seeks to continue. So one of the wider effects of Iran's behavior, its malign instability, is to increase risk to you and to your children. Talk about what we're doing about it, because I believe that we have covered Iran proxies and I'm mindful of time. First, you remember our national security strategy. One of the premises is that we want to increase our domestic economic capability, our prosperity, because that is the grounds upon which that we generate strength and can project power. Second, we want to defend our values throughout the world. Right? And three, of course, we want to share that through our network of allies and partners in order to create a more stable and secure world. The second part for the NDS, right? For the NDS, the pacing challenge, China, the acute threat of Russia, and of course the enduring threats, the persistent threat of Iran, the violent extremist organizations, and North Korea. So inside of that, U.S. Central Command has implemented a new strategy. This theater strategy for some of the academics in here is founded upon Walt's balance of threats theory, and it is actualized through our people's partners and innovation strategic approach. For our people, right, the bedrock of everything that we do, we are very grateful and we are mindful that we still have young people who are willing to step forward and serve in harm's way today in defense of our republic. The second are partnerships. The National Defense Strategy talks to our network as being a key asymmetric advantage. And you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that U.S. Central Command can serve as a security integrator, that we can approach our allies and partners. And what I mean for the difference of that is that some like Qatar as a non-NATO ally, same as Jordan, right? Same as Israel. And some are partners who are not major non-NATO allies. But if you approach them all in the same way and find where they are or common interests, then we can advance things that create a collective defensive capability. And it's important to note that this is defensive. For example, in the air domain, it's the Middle East Air Defense Initiative. As an example of what that looks like, I'll bring to you October of 2023. If you recall, the Houthis launched a barrage of one-way attack UASs. They also launched ballistic missiles and LACMs up the Red Sea. I would note the Houthi have an imperfect targeting mechanism that many of their actions threaten their Arab neighbors. But we are able to actualize our defensive capabilities to interdict these threats and shoot many of them down. To pause here for the Houthi, I would also ask the audience here to think, who is hurt most by Houthi actions? I would offer it's their Arab neighbors, beginning inside of Yemen, where I believe there is still an acute humanitarian crisis. Second, I would point to Egypt. The decrease in flows, remember 15% of the world's traffic, economic traffic, flows through the Bab el-Mandeb. And every time that they shoot at ships, right, increases the amount of cost that it takes to insure those ships. And if ships go around to the Cape of Good Hope, it increases the length of our supply line, reducing the overall amount of the containers and driving up costs and contributing to global inflation. And this hurts Arab neighbors. Continue on the strategic front of what we are doing. The last point, and I'm mindful of time, is to talk about innovation. And you might say, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, innovation is in a technical sense for what we're doing at U.S. Central Command that's taking the advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning in order to increase our ability and our warfighting edge. But two, also to take advantage of these things to increase our partners' ability to do things in other domains. I'll use an example of maritime domain awareness. You may or may not know that under U.S. Central Command, we have a naval component. That naval component has a task force called Task Force 59. One of its brightest minds was a Forbes 30 under 30, who was an amazing person named Skylar Moore, who then helped this command take uncrewed vessels at sea, pair them with manned ships to increase maritime domain awareness in order to interdict illegal flows of weapons. Because we only have so many ships, if you're able to use artificial intelligence, the open source information, you're able then to apply your naval assets more effectively and efficiently. But importantly, we share this. We share this with our allies and partners to help them protect their own sovereignty. As an example of things that we would do with innovation to support our approach of partnerships and support of our strategic objectives. And lastly, perhaps I will end upon a call about thought. We are not the owners of all good ideas. Part of the value of participating in these kind of fora is to hear from others and to hear from the audience, because that then helps us as professionals then think through the next steps, not least of which is the ongoing war in Gaza. And our partnership with academia, our partnership with other parts of our government will then enable us to offer up to our policymakers the most comprehensive recommendations that we can make in order to achieve our strategic objectives. So with that being said, I thought I would pause here for questions or comments or turn it back to the moderator for any questions or comments for all that. And I thank you for being here, and I thank the students for being here as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think I owe a specific gratitude to all of the moderators, all of the panelists. Your very comprehensive responses made my job easier, so I don't need to ask you a question. I'll leave it to the audience. We are going to start with the gentleman in the front. Please direct your question to the person that you want to ask question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, General. My question is actually for you. You mentioned, helping our allies, increasing their defensive capabilities, including a missile defense. Now, if I may, if you were sitting in Tehran and you're seeing your, regional countries increasing their defensive or missile defense capabilities, and let's say you were serving on the National Security Council in Tehran, what would you recommend the Iranians do? Because I think, even from an academic standpoint, that poses a direct challenge to one of the pillars of your defense strategy. Thank you.
Good. So to make sure I understand your question correctly, you're positing that increase in the defensive capability of allies and partners threatens somebody else.
Yes, the whole concept of security dilemma. Yeah, that's basically what I'm asking.
So the good news, I don't sit in Tehran, right? I sit here. But so recognizing that, so it's not an offensive capability. If your aim is to live in peace with your neighbors, right, this is not an offensive capability. Ours is defensive. We'll think of the work that we do with the GCC, right, to help them. These are all predicated on defensive capabilities. Now, you might say the model, for example, NATO and Russia, right? Russia views NATO as being inherently offensive. It's not, just the same way that we are. So in this case, the military efforts to create deterrence, right, integrated deterrence, is putting together all these instruments together. And ours is to increase the defensive capability, right, to support diplomacy, which is what our strategy says, in order to address those things, to find diplomatic solutions. Hopefully it helps answer your question. Thank you.
Sir.
My name is Ron Weaver, and I have a question about a tale of two resistances and a tale of two prosperities. Alex, with respect to returning American respect for the honor of those that we're talking about today, and those young men and those women, without selling out the United States' vital and legitimate interest and values in the central region, how can we restore a sense of American respect for the honor of the Iranian young men and young women and their allies? And the prosperity question is, what can we do with respect to the relative prosperities of those young men and young women versus our own with respect to those legitimate values and legitimate interests of the United States in and around Iran? And thirdly, what can this country do without selling out those vital interests with respect to decreasing the reality and appearance of colonialism persisting?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for that question. Look, I'll lump them together if you don't mind, in terms of what U.S. has as far as options are concerned. Look, I go back to a fundamental point, this level of suspicion that exists in the Islamic Republic. If you are serious, if you're Washington, and you make a decision, I want to find a way to see if I can coexist with the Islamic Republic, then you have to act politically. And to be honest with you, this country, I've been saying it for months, I'm sure everyone agrees, does not have an Iran policy, right? Right now, we don't have an Iran policy. It's just suspended, trying to avoid escalation. But say we come to a point where there is political will, bipartisan, it has to be, where you sit down, Democrats, Republicans, say, this is what we want to do vis-a-vis Iran. I think then you start getting the attention of the likes of Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards. And I think, if you can come up with a formula where you can coexist, and they give up on some of those core, at least rhetorical points that they repeat. United States has to leave the region. Israel doesn't have a right to exist. If you give them away on those two core issues, then I can see the Iranian leadership, certainly post Khamenei, because this is one of the key issues. Someone like Khamenei, who's going to turn 85 this month, he comes from a certain generation raised on almost Soviet-like propaganda against the United States. That first generation commanders of the Revolutionary Guards, most of them were in their 60s, mid-60s to late 60s. This is what they grew up with. But there will be a day where this first generation revolutionaries are gone, and they need to have a look hard at their society, their youth, the anger, what they need to do to satisfy the basic needs, and put the anger, the honor I was talking about next to, well, that's the past. They also had an issue with honor when it came to having ceasefire with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein killed 250,000 Iranians, but the regime was pragmatic enough to say, you know what? The survival of the regime depends on it. Let's do it. So, but right now, Khamenei's bottom line is this. This is, the Americans aren't serious. They pretend they want to talk, but end of the day, they want to go back to pre-1979. They want a regime that will be similar to the Shah's. They certainly don't want to see the continuation of the Islamic Republic. And for that reason, Khamenei is asking himself, why should I risk it? Why should I risk it in 2024 when I have Russia and China who can help me out? Where the sanctions regime will come to an end, where the world is splitting into the US-dominated economy and the Chinese-dominated. I can live without the US-dominated. I can trade in non-US dollar and so on. So he thinks time is on his side. He genuinely seems to believe in the idea of the United States, the West generally declining. But then again, going back, if you do put a serious offer on the table, if you're Washington, I think it's going to be harder than most people think for them to just reject it out of hand in the short term.
Thank you, Mr. Vakil. Ma'am?
Maddie Farid, I'm an analyst. This question probably is to General McKenzie and General Salene. Thank you both for your service. Given the fact that we are a few miles away from MacDill Air Base and we recently lost 3 of our soldiers, what is U.S. going to do to defend its strategic interest in the region? That's the question to you guys. And to the panel, I've heard quite a bit about the history and what the Iranian government is doing, weapons of mass destruction, drones, militia groups, but are we actually listening to the Iranian people, and how do we get the intel on the Iranian people to be able to address the fact and not let some of those rules of engagements that U.S. has, which actually restricts the U.S. from doing their job, whether it's fighting a war or irregular warfare. So if you could comment on any of that, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sir, should I defer to you, sir? Or... Very well, sir. One must be mindful of a previous boss here. So, great question, ma'am. Thank you very much on that one. I think there is one element about the Iranian people, which I will probably leave to others, but you would ask, like, what are things that we are doing to protect our interests? Well, I'll give you about 4 to start off with. So first, I don't know how much, probably most folks in this audience are aware of Operation Prosperity Guardian, right? This is a coalition that the United States had formed in response to the Houthi attacks on the freedom of navigation. Attacks on freedom of navigation, which, if you recall, on the page 42 of our national security strategy, which talks about the vital national interest of the United States in the region, formed that at sea, and we have young men and women like today doing that. So we've invested in that to maintain the freedom of navigation. I will point to number 2, Operation Inherent Resolve. As you recall, earlier this week that we began the Higher Military Commission. The Higher Military Commission is a dialogue with the Iraqi security forces, chaired by my boss, General Eric Kurilla, as well as with the Chief of Defense, General Yarallah, in Iraq. This Higher Military Commission is a dialogue which we will then seek to establish the conditions to move where we have a coalition in Iraq to a bilateral military-to-military relationship embedded in a broader governmental relationship to protect our interests, while at the same time enabling the Iraqi security forces to be able to sustain and protect their own sovereignty and to sustain the defeat of Daesh. We are doing that to protect our interests. The third item that we are doing to protect our interests, of course, is our ongoing relationship that we have with the Israeli Defense Forces. And I would note to you the ongoing work that we are doing in humanitarian assistance by all modes, air, land, and sea, in support of the President's announcement in the State of the Union, by which we would establish a temporary pier off the coast of Gaza to support the delivery of humanitarian assistance in light of the dire need. So those are a few things that we are doing now that we think that will protect our interests, but over time, it's maintaining the relationships that we have. So whatever it is that the next crisis comes, is it going to be in Lebanon? Is it going to be more with the Houthi? Is it going to be something that we just don't see right now, all the way throughout to Central Asia? that we have the bedrock of relationships in the mill-to-mill lane that would be able to support an effective response to deter aggression. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe Mackenzie. Thank you. Sir?
Cool. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate the breadth of perspectives, both academic and otherwise here. My name is JD Brown from USCENTCOM. The question I have kind of harkens back to some of the slides that Mr. Vatanka shared earlier, just a tidbit that's something we get kind of stuck in a lot on the analytics side from our end, trying to figure it out, is if Iranian isolation tends to benefit the IRGC and those in power specifically, is it safe for us to assume that Western efforts to provide political or economic relief to Iran will be undermined or derailed by those regime hardliners that benefit from kind of being isolated? And if so, does that create this double-edged sword or feedback loop where the West pressures Iran, inadvertently helping IRGC and the regime, the top of the regime, or we provide relief, which the IRGC then sends those resources to alarming groups or individuals, which inflames, Western views and policies, and then we just circle right back around again. So, and if that's a feedback loop we've been stuck in for decades now, how do we break out of that feedback loop?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Look, when we're talking about economic relations, one of the things we have to remember is the course of the last quarter of a century, Iranian trade patterns have shifted massively away from the West towards the East. That's not just unique to Iran. Everybody in the region today has China as their biggest trading partner. But in the case of Iran, it started really early on, by around year 2000. So the U.S., the West, U.S. doesn't trade with Iran. There's no trade. This is quite amazing, country of 90 million. So there is no economic leverage that the U.S. has, and the vice versa. So to your question, what can we take away from them? At this point, I think, and I might be a bit controversial, the only one thing they care about and are worried about is the might of the U.S. military. So the sanctions regime, all that, they've done it. They've been sanctioned on and off since State Department put Iran on the terrorism list back in, I think it was 1983, after the attack on the Marines in Beirut, right? They have dealt with sanctions. They used to be the most sanctioned country on earth. They're now second most sanctioned country after Russia. And you got to, Sanam talked about it, others have talked about it, what has happened in terms of the sanction busting industry. I'm sure many of you have gone to some of those ports in the Gulf, places in Central Asia. I've seen it with my own eyes in the mountains of the Caucasus when it comes to Russian sanction busting. And the Russians are learning from the Iranians, who are the masters in how do you go around sanctions. That leverage is gone. The United States right now needs to seriously think, actually, are we at a point where sanctions are hurting the US more than the countries that we're targeting? Because 50 years ago, there wasn't a China. There wasn't an alternative. A lot of these countries are now finding that alternative. So I'm not sure if that, the IRGC for sure, for a long time, have been involved in all sorts of illicit bad business. Don't take my word for it, take the words of the last 3 Iranian presidents who called them brother smugglers. They love the smuggling operations, money in it, and everyone he knows. But if you want to bring the regime to its knees on the sanctions front, I just don't think, I don't know. Maybe we can go back to the maximum pressure campaign. General McKenzie, in his remarks, said that the Biden administration, and I think Valia as well, they decided we're going to soften on the sanctions in return for some things that the Iranians are going to give to us as concessions. There might be a new administration in this country early next year. We might go back to maximum pressure campaign. Realities on Iran are not getting better. Despite the fact that the sanctions are not being enforced, the Iranian economy is still in free fall. There's a very angry population in that country. So who knows? I would not be too sure if I was the Islamic Republic that the next set of protests will go away as they did last time or the last few rounds. So, but I just don't think the sanction issue alone is gonna get their attention. There needs to be something more. It could be an incentive, or it could be a stick.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, and I have to apologize to the rest of the audience. And then after that question, we go with the wrapping up and concluding remarks. Mrs. Slavin?
Yeah, thanks, Arman. I'm Barbara Slavin from the Stimson Center, and I'll just keep it to one question for Major General Salene, if I may. You talked about Operation Prosperity Guardian. My understanding is that only Bahrain is actually part of that initiative. Why hasn't Saudi Arabia stepped up in this very important mission? And what does that say about the nature of CENTCOM relationships with these Arab countries, many of which seem to fear Iran more than they fear U.S. wrath? Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Salene. General.
Good. Thank you. I thought we might get a question along those lines. There's a difference between those. So Bahrain, of course, as you know, has publicly said about their support, and they're also home to our Fifth Fleet, as well as our Combined Maritime Force and the International Maritime Security Construct. I think I would not speak for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in their decision-making. And there is, perhaps in a different form, we could have a different discussion. I would just, but all I will say is I will respect it. But part of our job is we have to respect the sovereignty of others. Right? They have to make decisions upon based where they live. They speak to us about these things, but perhaps I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, General. So we are going with each panelist 2 minutes of concluding remarks. Mr. Vatanka, starting with you, then Dr. Vakil, and then General. Thank you.
I'll be quick. I just want to remind everybody, we've talked about it, but this is something I had on one of my slides about the axis of resistance and clear advantages as long as three key characteristics are maintained. Provide Iran regional power projection and geopolitical leverage at a relatively low direct financial cost. Second, by keeping distance, Tehran has been able to maintain deniability, right? Third, the whole model is based on being carried out as a war of attrition intended to keep the Iranian homeland safe from any blowback while exhausting Tehran's adversaries. The strategic patience. I mean, Ayatollah Khamenei in his speech last week basically said in so many words, I won't live long enough to see the end of Israel, but it will happen and the next generation will see it. This is not something that he thinks he will achieve next week or while he's alive. He's committed to the long term. But nonetheless, I think that basic model, the three pillars that I talk about, all of them right now being tested severely because for a couple of reasons, events in the region, and because of the fact that Israel may be soon to be backed more formidably by the United States, is not pushing back on that axis of resistance model in the region through kinetic action. And we've seen, again, just going back to January, following the death of those three American soldiers in Jordan, there's been basically ceasefire, right? The Iranian leadership decided this is too much for us to gamble, so they pulled away. So I think that the axis, Sanam will tell you in a minute why it's going to grow. Maybe it will grow, but at the same time, right now in the short term, I also think it's being really put to a test, unlike any time it ever been tested before. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vatanka. Dr. Vakil.
Thank you. Just a few closing points on what should be done or what could be done. I think the role of the U.S. is very clear. The Major General laid it out in terms of people, partnerships, innovation, and priorities. What is really urgently needed, I think above all, is, as has been already said, a bipartisan and consistent U.S.-Iran strategy, one that is not just directed to Iran, but region-wide. The region is also adaptive to how the West engages with Iran. And currently, over the course of a decade now, the region is feeling very insecure about the inconsistency of Western policy towards Iran and the region. And I think that also creates opportunities for a country like Iran to exploit. So I would lay that out there. Sanctions as an end rather than a means is very important. Democracies are clearly indicating they have no appetite to engage in military conflict, and so sanctions are the only tool on the table. And that on its own isn't going to be enough leverage to change Iranian behavior. And ultimately, what we haven't discussed is that sanctions punishes the Iranian people, or more broadly, populations that are in sanctioned economies, and that in itself doesn't create the empowerment or opportunities for better governance and accountability across the region. Finally, I think that what is abundantly clear are there are two key vacuums that require some deep international policy and thinking. And this isn't some lightning rod coming from the sky. It's the issue of Palestinian sovereignty, and it's the issue of Iran and its role in the region. Both are existential, actually. It might not feel existential from where we're sitting today here in Tampa, but I can tell you, as someone who sits in London and spends a lot of time in the Middle East, without addressing these two key pillars, the cycle of regional instability that will continue to drag the United States in is just going to continue to perpetuate. So the key for the US to address its national security strategy requires investing in addressing Iran's role in the region, its longtime hostility with Iran, but also ultimately closing down the security vacuum that is very much exploited at the issue of Palestinians. And that requires a plan, a pathway, irrevocable and credible, to quote the Saudis, to statehood. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vakil, General Salene.
It's fantastic comments. I'll keep mine short. Just, it's been said, for the Iranian regime, this challenge is likely to remain. I believe it behooves us to think longer and broader, longer in time. Whatever will happen next in the next phase in the war on Gaza, as a reminder, right, Israel was brutally attacked on the 7th of October. Whatever will happen next in the phases of the campaign is likely to change the environment. Some things may come soon, some things may come later, but we have to have the longer-term vision to what are the right recommendations to make in order to protect our long-term goals. Second, it's wider. Our part for the people wearing uniform is part of it. As you have said here, it is a longer-term policy objective that we should share with our like-minded allies and partners in order for it to be sustainable in the global context. And the third thing, and now looking at the young people where we began this conversation, for you, I'd recommend read, think, engage in debate, push back on these things, right? Because one day the future will be you. Our future is with you. And I appreciate the opportunity to be part of it today. Thank you.